We've now come to the final lesson in Fireworking 101. I'm going to make a break here between Fireworking 101 and Fireworking 201. We've covered a large number of preliminary skills, techniques, lessons to master in order to even begin making fireworks. And then we've actually made some fireworks devices such as gerbs, ganged gerbs in a W formation, and then wheels, both charcoal spark wheels and metal spark drivers on wheels. So we've come a long way in Fireworking 101, and now I want to bring it all that together in a fairly complex project which will incorporate and utilize all of the lessons we have covered up till now. What we're going to work on is known as the Chromatrope fireworks wheel. Chromatropes are not a well-known item anymore. Some people still know what a kaleidoscope is. A kaleidoscope and a chromatrope were devices back in the 1800s. They were developed back in the 1800s, and kaleidoscopes are still available, sometimes in high-end jewelry stores or art stores. A chromatrope was a device. I'll insert a photograph of a chromatrope. It was a device through which light was projected with counter-rotating glass plates that had designs on them in a spiral fashion, and that projected light on a wall or a projection screen created a very interesting interplay of those two spiral patterns of light on the screen. So it's kind of a novelty entertainment technology device from back in the 1800s. I looked it up on Wikipedia and found an article about Sir David Brewster, who invented the chromatrope, and I think he also invented the kaleidoscope. Chromatrope fireworks wheels take that essential idea, an interplaying pattern of light, spiraling light, and incorporate it into a fireworks device. In Weingart's Pyrotechnics, he has a sketch of a chromatrope and how it can be laid out, and he also has a sketch, a little drawing of how the interplay of spiraling spark patterns can look when the chromatrope is displaying. Weingart's chromatrope, it consists of two wheels, each having 4 arms, one going one direction, one going the other direction, with gerbs on a 45-degree angle off the ends of those arms, creating the sprays of sparks we've seen in our fireworks wheels. And that those interplaying sprays of sparks, as the two wheels counter-rotate, create the pattern that a chromatrope, the actual old Sir David Brewster device, would create with simple projected light. And so what we're going to make is 2 4-arm wheels that counter-rotate, one going one direction, one going the other direction, spewing sprays of sparks from our gerb drivers and creating that interplaying spray of sparks. That pattern that is so interesting. There's also some information about chromatropes in the old Westech fireworks manuals. Bill Schmidt compiled all the Westech firework manuals into one updated edition and I'm making that available in the fireworking.com store, since it's not available anywhere else that I know of. But in the West Tech Fireworks Manual, there's also some information about chromatropes and how they can be designed and the effects they can incorporate. Traditionally, chromatropes, whereas our wheels that we've made so far have had the drivers at 90 degrees to the arms, traditionally chromatrope wheels have the drivers at 45 degrees to the arms. So they're not only creating thrust that turns the wheel, they're also creating outward forced sprays of sparks as they turn. One trick I'll incorporate into this chromatrope wheel, which is sometimes shown and described in the old descriptions of chromatropes and sometimes not. In Weingart's description of a chromatrope, both drivers, the first set of drivers and then the second set of drivers, have the wheels spinning in the same direction. Let's say the drivers have each wheel spinning clockwise. From the front, this wheel is spinning clockwise. And if I looked at the back wheel from the back, it is spinning clockwise. But looked at from only one side, either the front or the back, the two wheels are spinning and they're counter-rotating. One is turning clockwise, one is turning counterclockwise. The nice thing is I can make both wheels, looked at from the front, that turn initially clockwise, but when they're mounted on my support, they will counter-rotate. The one effect that is sometimes incorporated into chromatropes is having them reverse. As I showed in the wheels in the wheel project, it is possible to have a wheel reverse between the first and second stages of drivers. Initially, intuitively, I didn't understand the importance of having the wheels reverse, the value of having the wheels reverse. If looked at from the front, if one wheel is turning clockwise and the other wheel turning counterclockwise, what difference is it going to make to the display if they then reverse? Because still, looked at from the front, where the two effects merge, one is turning clockwise and one is turning counterclockwise. The advantage is that the real interesting interplay of spark sprays occurs when, let's say, one is turning clockwise, one is turning counterclockwise very rapidly as they end up turning. But then, when the second stage lights, as we've seen in the other wheel project, the videos of the other wheel project, the wheels slow down and then they reverse. And during that slowdown and during the initial slow phase of the reversal is where a very interesting, unpredictable, creative pattern gets created. So there is value in having these wheels reverse as the wheel is displaying. So I am going to have the wheels reverse. You can see that it's going to be necessary to create a support that separates the wheels somewhat so they don't bonk into each other and stall each other. I'll be building a support that's built out of two 2x4s screwed together, mounted to a fence post. I'm going to put some guy wires on it to keep it from wobbling. I will use the kind of spacer blocks behind the wheels that I used in the other wheel project. So the wheels are actually going to be separated by practically a foot of distance. But when viewed from the front, the effect of both of them will merge together, and that separation will not be noticeable at all. One advantage to having the drivers mounted on a 45-degree angle at the end of each arm is that the diameter of the display increases. A little sketch shows that when drivers are mounted to the arms at 90-degree angles, let's say that the display ends up being 16 foot 6 inches in diameter, if this is to scale. When I mount the drivers at a 45-degree angle, the diameter of the display increases to 19 foot 3 inches as a hypothetical example. So the diameter of the display, the size of the display, is increased. One additional effect of mounting the drivers at a 45-degree angle is the thrust from each driver is reduced. If I mount the driver at a 90-degree angle to the arm, all of the thrust is turning that arm and the wheel with its full thrust. When I mount the driver at a 45-degree angle, some of the thrust is projected outward and some of the thrust is projected to the side, and so only about half the thrust is actually turning the wheel. Whereas in the wheel project, there were drivers on 2 arms burning at once. In this project, there will be 4 drivers burning at once. 4 charcoal drivers will be burning, turning this wheel, and then it'll change to 4 ferrotitanium drivers turning the wheel. So even though the thrust is somewhat diminished by the angle that the gerbs will be mounted on, we have twice as many drivers burning at once on these wheels. So the thrust should stay about the same. The wheel is going to be a little heavier with 8 drivers on each wheel as opposed to 4 drivers on each wheel that we had in the wheel project. So the weight's going to be increased. I'm actually going to increase the diameter just a little bit to almost 6 feet, probably more like 5 feet. And the weight is increased, the size is increased, but the thrust, the number of drivers burning at once is doubled, but their thrust is reduced a little bit. So there's a little bit of a balancing act in developing thrust on this wheel. And one of the things I'll be watching for is how fast these wheels actually turn, how easily they actually turn with the configuration I'm designing. Some of this project is a little bit experimental. One option that is shown by Weingart is, in addition to the large counter-rotating wheels, a smaller, say a 2-foot wheel can be mounted in the center of the assembly on the front, and even 2 of them can be mounted, one on the front, one on the back, counter-rotating, with those displays also interfering with each other and creating nice patterns. A 2-foot diameter wheel could be mounted either on the front or both on the front and the back and the center to sort of fill in the blank space that will be on the inside of the Chromatrope as it's displayed. I'm going to make one Chromatrope with the 2 counter-rotating 5 to 6 foot wheels, and then I will make one with counter-rotating inner wheels as well, just to see how that affects the overall display. One complication with mounting a smaller wheel on the inside of this will be that the spray from those sparks is going to be coming out, and potentially, we talked about cross-firing in the wheel project, potentially the spray of the sparks from the inner wheel could ignite the fusing to the second stage on the outer wheel. So I have to be careful as I'm designing that inner wheel to prevent the kind of cross-firing that we had to work at preventing when we were making standard wheels. So there are some design considerations, some construction considerations that have to be taken into account when the Chromatrope is being designed and constructed. Because the gerbs are going to be mounted on an angle on the ends of the larger wheel, I want to mount the Chromatrope higher than just the 8-foot that I was mounting the standard wheels at. I'm actually going to create a 12-foot tall support to enable the full spread of the sparks in the display from the Chromatrope to display without the ground interfering with it. So I am going to make a 12-foot tall support for the Chromatrope. I have a relatively small workspace that I work in. I don't have a real big shop, and I am envisioning this Chromatrope starting off with the 4-foot frame that I made my 4-foot wheels with in the wheel project, and even enlarging that a little bit with the ends I'm going to construct for the Chromatrope. So I can't assemble this assembly all in one unit easily. If I had a large table in the middle of a large shop, I could conceivably do that. But what I'm going to do instead is create ends with 1-foot long pieces of my 1/4 inch by 1.5 inch lattice, a slat. I'm going to create ends 1 foot long that will then screw onto the ends of my, if I can get that in here nicely, this is one of the ends of my 4-foot wheel. I'm going to lap this over 6 inches and put in 4 or 5 half-inch screws attaching the slat to this arm after I have the ends assembled and fused, at least some of the initial fusing done. So you can see why, if this is the end of a 2-foot arm on my 4-foot wheel, I'm going to be extending that by practically another foot. That's why I'm saying this wheel, the Chromatrope wheels, are going to end up being 5 to 6 feet in diameter. The way I am envisioning, since I do want this to reverse, the way I'm envisioning the installation of the drivers is that my charcoal driver, angled at 45 degrees, is going to turn the initial stage of the wheel clockwise. Then that is going to burn through to its end and pass fire to the thrust end of a ferrotitanium driver mounted at the other 45-degree angle to the end of the arm, and that will reverse the wheel going in the counterclockwise direction. So I did a little sketching, envisioned my slat with the charcoal driver driving it clockwise, the ferrotitanium driver then driving it counterclockwise, and I had to sort of do a little sketching to determine what kind of hole pattern could I use to have iron wire supports for both the charcoal driver and the ferrotitanium driver, and I came up with this kind of hole pattern. So I cut 8 of my 12-foot long pieces of 1.5 inch by 1/4 inch slat, and I drilled my holes, my mounting holes, in one end of each of those slats. The first hole is centered and in 1/4 inch. The side holes are in 3/4 inch by 1/4 inch from the sides. This fourth hole is in 1 1/4 inch and centered. That creates about 3/4 inch between each hole, through which I'm going to put the iron wire ties to mount the gerb drivers. So I do have my double-nosed 8 charcoal drivers rammed with the thrust and pass fire ends marked, and I have my 8 single-nosed ferrotitanium drivers rammed just like we did in the standard wheel projects. I've got my drilled 1-foot arm end. I want to bend the iron ties so they'll go through those 2 holes, which are 3/4 inch apart. I found an easy way to do that is to hold the wire on a piece of 3/4 inch lumber like this and bend the wires like that. Now I can see, visualizing it, that I want my 2 tie wires going through the front of the slat to hold the charcoal driver through these holes and these holes. So those 2 holes I'll put a tie wire through. These holes I drilled are 1/8 inch diameter, and they are large enough diameter to let 2 pieces of the iron tie wire go through each hole, which I'll show you why that's important. So there are the tie wires for my charcoal drivers. If I flip it over, I want the tie wires to go this way in this pair of holes and this pair of holes to hold on the ferrotitanium driver. So I want the tie wire to go through from this side into this hole and this hole. And so this will create the 2 pairs of tie wires using the 4 holes with 2 wires going through each pair of holes. And then I'm going to mount the drivers the same way I did by twisting the ends. I'm going to mount the drivers the same way as I mounted the drivers in the wheel project. Might not be a bad idea next time to drill these holes a little bit bigger to make this step a little bit easier. I think I'll do that on the rest of the arms. Just mount or drill the holes just a little bit bigger. And then just by pressing down on the slat, I can push the wires the rest of the way through nicely. And so this is the front side where I will strap on a ferrite titanium driver, always keeping strap on a charcoal driver, always keeping the thrust end out on the arm. This will turn it clockwise, and then I will do the same thing from the back side with a ferrite titanium driver, thrusting the other direction but still thrusting outward on the arm, and I'll end up with an end that looks like this, and I'll repeat that 8 times. So I'm on the 8th arm extension, mounting the driver to it. I have increased the holes in the slats, those 1-foot slats, to 5 32nd-inch holes, making this whole process a lot easier. That first arm I showed being mounted with gerbs was a little bit clumsy. After you do something 7 or 8 times, it gets a little less clumsy. So I'll sort of show real quickly how this is done in a little more comfortable manner. When we get into complex devices like this one, which will take, oh heck, between ramming all the drivers, assembling everything on the 2 Chromatrope wheels, assembling the Chromatrope wheels on their support, you know, you can have a very, very full day or 2 days in a project like this. And the question starts to be, from some people, why in the world would you put 2 days worth of labor into a device that's going to display for a minute? And it's a good question. Maybe we're just a little bit crazy. But, you know, if you spend 2 days preparing for a feast for your family on the holidays, or if you spend weeks working on a sculpture or a painting in order to step back and appreciate it for a moment and show it to your friends for a little bit, each one who appreciates it for a moment. Or if you build a device that displays for a moment but entertains a crowd of 100 people, well, if it displays for a minute, you've created 100 minutes of entertainment with it, with those 100 people. So that's one way to look at it. Nobody ever claimed that building fireworks was a way to save time and money. It's a satisfying art. That thrust going up and out. Satisfying art that takes time. We don't do this because it's easy. We do it because it's challenging. It'd be a whole lot easier to go buy a couple wheels at the Class C store, mount them in a creative way, and put on a backyard display. And there's a lot to be said for creating a nice backyard display. But I want to create a Chromatrope, which is going to take me a couple days total labor to do. And it's just the way it is. It's either worth it to me to do it or it's not. I can either know that somebody gets why it's a worthwhile endeavor, or get that no amount of my explaining will allow them to see that it's a worthwhile endeavor. If you don't get it, there's not enough words to make you get it, and if you do get it, I don't need to spend any time helping you get it. After I have all these mounted, this is the 8th arm, then we'll go on to fusing, doing some preliminary fusing of the arms before they're mounted to the actual wheels, which will facilitate that process and be a whole lot easier to do on this little workbench space than it would be to do if the arms were already attached to the wheels. After I get done with each arm, I look at it closely, make sure that I have both nozzles pointing in the correct direction outward on the arms, that the angles are both at about 45-degree angles to the slat, which makes them be about 90 degrees to each other. Holding it in this direction, the thrust from the charcoal drivers driving the wheel in a clockwise direction, and then the thrust from the ferrotitanium driver will drive it in a counterclockwise direction. So there are all 8 arms with the gerb drivers mounted to them. Now, to prepare to do some fusing on this, preliminary fusing, here are 2 arms from my 4-foot wheel going to here and here, and 2 of the ends temporarily laid in place, lapping over those arms about 6 inches. What I want to do when this is completely fused together is create a complete circle of fusing, linking all of the thrust ends of the charcoal drivers together in a circle, and then a complete circle of fusing linking the thrust ends from the ferrotitanium drivers in a complete circle. And I also want the pass fire ends from the charcoal drivers linked into the thrust end, the ignition end of the ferrotitanium drivers. So I'm going to have a short fuse connecting these 2 ends on each end, and then coming out of the thrust end of each ferrotitanium driver, I'm going to have a half of a fuse that goes to the next ferrotitanium driver, which will be hooked up to half of a fuse coming from the adjacent ferrotitanium driver. And in a similar way, on the thrust end of the charcoal drivers, I'm going to have half of one of those legs between adjacent drivers coming from this thrust end over that direction, and half of it going that direction. I've determined here, just by this temporary layout, that there is about 48 inches between the thrust ends of the charcoal drivers that are next to each other, and also the thrust ends of the ferrotitanium drivers that are next to each other. So I'll show all that in a little more detail when I'm actually assembling the complete wheel. But the bottom line is, in a preliminary fashion, I want to put a fuse going from the pass fire end of the charcoal driver up into the thrust end of a ferrotitanium driver. Out of that, I'm actually going to have 3 fuses going in there, a 2-foot fuse going that direction and a 2-foot fuse going this direction. And I'm also going to have a 2-foot fuse going to the right and to the left out of the thrust end of the charcoal drivers. And I'm going to do that fusing preliminarily as I'm sitting here at my workbench. So here's the fusing I'm going to use on each arm. I've got a piece of pipe with doubled match in it. One end has one piece of the match sticking out 3/4 of an inch. That's going to go into the ignition nozzle end of the ferrotitanium driver. It's going to come down here, and this 2 pieces of black match sticking out here are going to nestle again against the pass fire bared flush propellant grain end of the pass fire end of the charcoal driver. And then coming out of the end of the ferrotitanium driver also is going to be a piece of fuse going this direction and a piece of fuse going this direction. This is my piece of my 2-foot piece of match pipe with doubled match inside of it. That's going to take fire from the ignition end of the ferrotitanium driver to the right and also to the left to create that circle of fuse that I'm talking about, connecting all of the ignition ends of the ferrotitanium drivers for a nice redundant pass fire ring that connects all of those ignition ends of the ferrotitanium drivers together. And I'm also going to have 2-foot pieces of quick match going from the ignition end of the charcoal gerb drivers right and left to create a redundant ignition ring of all those ends. So that's what that fusing is going to look like. I'm going to install all that in the same way that I've done in the gerb projects and in the other wheel projects, inserting one piece of the black match down into the nozzle where there is a nozzle on the end of the ferrotitanium driver and the charcoal driver, and just folding over the black match against the exposed propellant of the charcoal driver for pass fire. So I'll install all that and then show you what that looks like when that's done. There then is what that fusing looks like. There's going to be an ignition ring, a complete ignition ring. This fuse going to the left is going to connect to the fuse coming from the adjacent charcoal driver ignition end to the left. Likewise, this fuse going to the right is going to connect to the fuse coming from the ignition end of the charcoal driver to the right, creating a redundant complete ring of ignition fusing into which I will install an ignition fuse somewhere in that ring, probably in 2 places in that ring for some redundancy. The pass fire from the charcoal drivers going up to the ignition end of the ferrotitanium driver, and likewise the ignition end of the ferrotitanium driver has 2 fuses, one going to the right one going to the left of the fusing to the ferrotitanium driver to the left, and one going to the right to the fuse coming from the ignition end of the ferrotitanium driver to the right. So each end is going to have that fusing installed here on the workbench before I assemble the whole wheel. I now have all 8 of my arms finished with the 2 gerbs attached to the end of each of the little 1-foot slat arms. I'm going to now attach them to the 8 ends of the 2 wheels, lapping that 1-foot piece onto the 4-foot arm by 6 inches. And screwing the 2 together with 1/2-inch screws. I'm keeping the screws away from the end of the wood and the sides of the wood to try to minimize splitting as much as possible, but I'm still getting a little bit of splitting, but that won't hurt anything. And then after I screw the ends on all the arms of the 4-foot wheel, I'll be attaching the thrust ends of the charcoal drivers all together with that fusing, and the thrust ends of the ferrotitanium drivers with that fusing going in both directions, making ignition rings of fusing on the arm, on the whole wheel. And I'll find a way to get a farther, more distant video of what that all looks like once I get that all hooked up. I am getting enough splitting on the short 1-foot slats that it's a concern, so I'm going to pre-drill the holes through the short slat and then screw through those large holes into the arm of the 4-foot wheel. much better. I don't like it when I see split wood like that. One thing that's not a bad idea at all to take into consideration is the use of an electric drill like this while we're working on fireworks. If I turn the lights off in here and run this, way down deep inside there I can see the reflection of some sparks going on in that drill. Some folks will take some duct tape and tape up the vents on the drill while they're working if they're afraid of igniting the fusing or whatever they're working on with the drill. I am in a safe location with nothing exposed, and I'm not holding this right against any fusing or anything, but it is something I'm taking into consideration. Is there a possibility of this igniting this, and if it did, what would I do? I can get out my door real rapidly, and I would lose the end of this gerb. I would toss it out the door real quick if possible. I've got nothing else exposed in here, but it is something to take into consideration, is the use of a power tool like this and how to avoid any problems with that. If I was being really conscientious, I would put some tape around this, but I am not. This isn't throwing sparks, and I'm not using it right against anything where it could ignite it. Here then is one of the fully assembled and fused wheels. As I said, looked at from the front with the spindle hub, the threaded nipple hub going to the back, to the rear as a standoff. Both of the wheels turn clockwise at first and then reverse counterclockwise. But one will be mounted to the front of the support, and one will be flipped around and mounted to the back of the support. So they will counter-rotate when viewed from one side where the audience will be. And then they'll reverse and slow down and then begin counter-rotating in the other direction. I have this, quote, ring of fusing tying all of the ignition ends of the first drivers, the charcoal drivers, together. And coming out in two places at the bottom of that ring are two lengths of quick match being bucketed into one length, which I'll use for the initial ignition fusing. So the ignition fire will come up here, split two directions, go that direction and that direction, lighting all the charcoal drivers on this wheel. And I'll have the same fusing on the back wheel, and both of those ignition fuses will come together into a bucket and be tied together down here. So all the ignition fusing will be tied together. Then the pass fires from the first drivers, the first stage drivers, the charcoal drivers, all those pass fires go to the ignition end of the ferrotitanium drivers. And there's also fusing that ties the ignition ends of all the ferrotitanium drivers together for some redundancy. I'm gonna show. I had to piece in pieces of quick match between the fusing that I had installed on the drivers on the workbench. I'll show a little detail of how I do that. There's a little bit of a trick to doing that. And one thing I did do before fusing the ferrotitanium drivers together was bend the fusing, the ignition loop fusing. I bent that down and tied it to the ends, tied it to the top part, the ignition end, the thrust end of the ferrotitanium drivers. My goal was to get these two loops of fusing as separated as possible. You can see they only kind of cross in one location, and they're also separated front to back by some distance to really reduce the chance of any cross-firing going on. I'll show a detail of the support. I'm going to support this 12 feet in the air. Like I say, one wheel mounted to the front and one wheel mounted to the back. I'll show a detail of that mounting system. But that's what the finished wheel with the fused drivers looks like. As I was working on fusing all of the Chromatrope drivers together in the two ignition loops, the front one for the charcoal drivers and the rear one for the ferrotitanium drivers, there were a couple fusing operations that I was doing that I have not really detailed, which I thought I would go ahead and detail. Right here I've simulated the fusing coming from, say, one charcoal driver ignition end and the fusing coming from the other adjacent charcoal driver ignition end. And the fuses, the quick match fusing was too short to connect right together, so I've got a piece of quick match in between these two and join them together. I'll show you how I did that. First thing I did was bare about an inch of the black match on both of those lengths of fusing. Next, I want to make a cut a piece of match pipe that's about an inch longer and will lap over this match pipe, and about an inch longer and will lap over the pipe on this piece of quick match. So I'll cut that there. Then I want to install two pieces of black match in that pipe, sticking out about an inch and a half longer. Sticking out about an inch and a half, which is longer than the black match sticking out of these pipes. That makes the next steps a little easier. So I've got about an inch and a half sticking out there. I'm going to cut this so about an inch and a half sticks out here. Now what I'm going to do is, while pinching the pipe closed on this scab piece that I'm putting in, I insert the black match, the longer black match ends, into this pipe and slide that down. And then when I get to the shorter length sticking out of this one, I'm sliding that down. So the black match from each pipe is going into the other pipe. And then I'm folding this and crimping it around to make it a smaller diameter. But I'm not holding it here when I slide it into the other pipe. I'm still holding it up here so the black match in this pipe doesn't slide. And I work that in to the other pipe like that, and then I shove it in so that 1 inch is lapped in there, and I can make sure that I still got my 1 inch lap over here. So the black matches are nestled against each other at least 1 inch in there, and the pipes are slid and mated together, but I've got no exposed black match ends anywhere in that junction. I want to make this completely spark proof, flame proof, so to avoid crossfiring. And then I just put a clove hitch around this junction, making sure that the clove hitch is in a location where it's grabbing both of those pipes and is around all 4 of those lengths of black match, tying all that together nicely. And you can visualize how that makes a nice flame-proof, spark-proof junction at that point. I still have, because I was holding that here, the black match did not slide. I've still got my black match sticking out here an inch and a half. I'm going to do the same thing now down at this end. Slide the long pieces of black match in to that pipe, allow the shorter pieces to slide in there, and then crimp this together to lessen the diameter of that pipe and slide that in, allowing it to slide over the black match. This is just a little tricky, but it can be done. I've got to make sure not to be pinching that black match in there, or else it won't allow it to slide together. Come on, baby. There we go. And that's sliding in that 1 inch there. So the black match is lapped against each other, and the pipes are mated that 1 inch and lapped around each other, and I'll tie that there. So that's how to tie ends of quick match together and tie a scab piece between 2 ends of quick match fusing, like I had to do in that wheel in a couple places. And then into the front fusing on the charcoal drivers, that front fusing loop, I then wanted to install at the proper location an ignition fuse. Let's pretend this is my single ignition fuse that wants to go into this match pipe here. What I did there was take an awl and pierce this pipe, opening up a little window and looking in there, even verifying it with a flashlight, to make sure I'm looking right at black match in there. I'm not in between the layers of pipe paper. I'm right down to the black match in there. And then I work, I've got exposed 1 inch or so of black match here. I work that down alongside the black match in the fuse that I'm installing this ignition fuse into, sort of crimp the pipe on this and once again shove that down into that pipe, about in ½ inch or 3/4 of an inch. I'm flame proofing that with a piece of tape like that, and I'm also going to tie this just to secure the 2 fuses together. I'm going to tie this here. So that's some details on some of the ways I was having to fuse the drivers and fusing together on the Chromatrope wheel. That junction there now for that ignition fuse is nice and flame proof and secure. It can't be pulled out. Another question that came to mind as I was building the Chromatrope wheels was whether I should spray paint the frames black. I didn't want to do that initially because I wanted to be able to see the details of how the drivers were all joined to it and everything. I'm going to see when I burn this first Chromatrope whether that frame shows up, since it's white wood. On the wheels, the white wood frames were not showing up, so I don't think I'm too worried about it, but I am going to pay attention to that, and if those frames show up at all on subsequent wheels where I use those frames, I will spray paint them black. And then also on the overall fusing of the Chromatrope wheel, I was paying attention to visualizing when the ignition fuse lights the first loop of fusing, how the fire is going to go in there and how it's going to light each of those 4 drivers, then how the pass fire fusing works and how that second loop, the ignition loop for the ferrotitanium drivers works. As I was putting all that together and as I step back and look at it, I'm looking and visualizing how all that ignition is going to work and making sure all the fusing is routed correctly and there's some separation distance between the front loop and back loop. I'll pay special attention to that after I get the wheels mounted to the support to avoid cross-firing. So I'm always looking for what could go wrong and visualizing how everything is routed to make sure as much as possible that it will go right. Well, there's that nice big Chromatrope all set up on its support and ready to fire up this evening. I'm going to do one to test tonight, and then I'm going to do one when the family's over here for Christmas Eve. What I have done is drive a fence post in the ground, and then I've put my support, which is a doubled 2x4, up against the fence post, held it in place temporarily with some duct tape, and then also put a wire wrap around it, top and bottom, for good sturdy support. And then to keep it from wobbling, I have put 3 guy wires coming off in 3 directions, separated by 120 degrees, going down to rebar posts that hold the wire in place securely. And that doubled 2x4 is 12 feet tall. You can see how I have spaced
the wheels apart. It's a double 2x4, which is 3 inches wide. Then I've put doubled 2x4s on both the front and the back of that to make it a total of, what's 3 times 3 is 9 inches wide. So the wheels themselves are separated by 9 inches plus the 2 inches of the threaded tube behind the wheels. So 4 plus 9, they're separated by about 13 inches. The bottoms are nicely separated from the support, and they're separated from each other up top. I spun the wheels to make sure that they do spin freely. And as I put the wheels up, I did make sure that the front and back fusing is good and supported, good and separated from each other. The ignition fuse, that Y's coming off the front ignition rings on both wheels, those 2 Y's come down into a bucket, and then that comes into a quick match leader and to some visco fusing. The nice thing about this is that one fun thing about ignition itself on these things is in between each knot in the quick match there's a pop, 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 and you can see the flame and the little explosions as the ignition goes up to the wheels and then around the perimeter of the wheels as it ignites, which makes for even interesting ignition of the device as the audience is watching it. So we'll see how this goes tonight. One thing I'd mention is that I did bend the support bolts, the 1/4 inch bolts that go into the 2x4 support, bent them upwards just a little bit to keep a good clearance at the top of the wheels, but also to make sure that the bottom of the wheels have a good clearance between them and the support. So hopefully, as this is all rotating, the 2 wheels counter-rotating, we won't have any collisions between them and themselves or them and the support, and they'll keep turning freely. This back wheel, looked at it from the back, will start off burning clockwise. The front wheel, looked at from the front, will start off burning clockwise, but looked at from one side, the wheels will counter-rotate. The front one will turn clockwise, and looked at from the front, the back one will appear to be turning counterclockwise. Ah, beautiful. For this next Chromatrope, I have dusted all the slats with black spray paint to darken them up and hide them, especially since I want to put a small wheel in the center of the front side of the Chromatrope, just to fill that center 4-foot, 5-foot void with some sparks. And I'm trying to figure out how small I can make a wheel and still have the spray of the drivers miss each other. I think this is about as small as I can get. If I go 1/4 inch on either side of the drivers, that's about 11.5 inches. I think I'm going to make a 12-inch wheel, measuring out 6 inches from the center, cut the arms off, and then mount the drivers. So I'm going to make a 12-inch wheel to fill that center with sparks. I will make it a charcoal, going clockwise, charcoal driver wheel reversing to a ferrotitanium wheel. Well, there's the little wheel I'll put in the center. I'll use a longer, I think this is a 6-inch by 1/4 inch bolt, lag bolt, yeah, 6-inch. I'll use a longer bolt in the center that goes through this 1.5-inch hub, and then through the 3-inch hub of the larger Chromatrope wheel, and then 1.5 inches into the support. And so this will be bolted right into the center
of the front Chromatrope wheel. Once again, the initial ignition point, which I'll tie into the ignition ring on the Chromatrope, lights the thrust end of both charcoal drivers. We'll spin it clockwise. Then the pass fire end of the two charcoal drivers will light the thrust ends of the ferrotitanium drivers and reverse it and spin it counterclockwise. And I do have the redundant pass fire fusing between the two thrust ends of the ferrotitanium drivers. As I'm looking at this and imagining where this could crossfire, I always try to imagine what could go wrong. When these first two initial ignition ends on the charcoal drivers light, they're going to be spewing out here, which is awfully close to the ignition end of the ferrotitanium drivers. In a situation like that, I do have some aluminum duct tape that I get at Home Depot that I can sort of help flame proof the ends, the ignition ends of the ferrotitanium drivers. This is a fairly thick aluminum foil duct tape, and I will just help flame proof these ignition ends of the ferrotitanium drivers, just in case that flame from the charcoal driver starts spewing out on an angle initially or something until it burns away the nosing. I'd like to really protect the ignition end of the ferrotitanium drivers so they don't light prematurely. I just always try to imagine what could go wrong and then try to head that off. So I'll do that to the ignition end of both ferrotitanium drivers and then mount this at the same time I mount the Chromatrope wheels. Like I said, this ignition end for the charcoal drivers will tie into the ignition ring of the Chromatrope. I think this will fill the center void that I see in that first Chromatrope display, which is not really objectionable, but I'm interested to see if this creates a more complete, thorough disc of sparks, starting from the center on out, and maybe makes it a more pleasing display. I'll compare the video of the two and see which I prefer, but I'm pretty optimistic this will add to the effect. So there we go. Nice little wheel. Ought to spin really fast. And there's that center little wheel mounted toward the audience on the audience side of the whole assembly. As I sit here sort of wrapping up the Chromatrope lesson, this is where I'm going to wrap up and stop Fireworking 101. And next I'm going to go to Fireworking 201. I think that as I look over what we've covered in Fireworking 101, for a raw beginner, there's a lot to learn here. There are a lot of skills to practice. There are a lot of different devices to play with, making and dial in until they're working successfully. We've covered an introduction, safety measures and precautions, the various chemicals we're using, how to pulverize those chemicals, the weighing and mixing of the chemicals into a composition. We've covered the tooling that we're using for the gerbs. We've looked at different supplies we're going to be using, how to make black match, how to make pipe to make piped match, which we call quick match, and then how to begin actually putting all that together into making gerbs, then making a ganged W of gerbs, then getting even more complex with some wheel assemblies and some different fusing techniques, and then finally a pretty advanced project, this Chromatrope project. So if you are a raw beginner, I would suggest spending a month or two actually practicing, going back, reviewing those videos, and actually practicing making some of these devices and getting a feel for them. Because all of this will be built upon, as I then move on to Fireworking 201, all of that's going to be housed in-house in fireworking.com. And I am then building on all of Fireworking 101. In Fireworking 201, I'm going to be showing how to make a simple way to make black powder, how to test that black powder to make sure that it is powerful enough to accomplish the work that we are going to do with the black powder. We're going to make a small black powder maroon, which is a ground report salute. I'm going to show a couple different ways of making fireworks stars, both pump stars and cut stars. Some simple charcoal stars of various speeds, where the speed of the stars can be adjusted for longer or shorter burn times. And then also the inclusion of some metals in those fireworks stars to even increase the variety of effects we can achieve with them. Then with those stars and with that black powder and with the match and the fusing we've already learned to make, we're going to learn how to make aerial mines. We're also going to explore how to electrically ignite fireworks devices such as the aerial mines. I'm going to show some information about firing systems and release points on something like a wheel or a chromatrope where you want the fusing to release once it's ignited. I'm going to show how to make spillets, which are a rammed time fuse for the aerial shells, 4-inch cylindrical traditional Rinfasciature construction aerial shells, which we're going to make after we learn how to make the rammed spillet time fuses for them. Then we're going to look at rocket motors, how to make them, add metal sparks to those rocket motors, to the delay composition in a rocket motor to create a metal spark tail on a rocket motor as opposed to the simple charcoal spark tails we'll make initially. Then we'll show how to use the 4-inch cylindrical shells as rocket headings, some slightly different construction techniques to make rocket headings and mount them to the rocket motors. And we're going to show how to totally assemble a rocket heading, motor, and stick and fusing and a launch tube in a total rocket assembly project. And I'll also show how to electrically fire rockets. And then finally, I think we'll look at a winged tourbillon, which is a flying, simple, spin-stabilized rocket motor type of device in effect. So Fireworking 201 will explore a lot of interesting devices, a wide variety of devices, and it will use all of the skills and a lot of the supplies we've made, such as black match and match pipe, and all the skills we've used in Fireworking 101. So once you get the hang of all the things that are covered in Fireworking 101, Fireworking 201 will be sitting there waiting to take you to a more advanced level of fireworking. So enjoy your fireworking, and I will see you in Fireworking 201.